So welcome to the third evening of Israeli Apartheid Week. It's the 8th annual Israeli Apartheid Week. Now, in an open in an open letter dated October 21st, 2011, Palestinian students wrote, "We hope you put boycott, divestment, and sanctions (BDS) at the forefront of your campaign and join together for Israeli Apartheid Week, the pinnacle of action across universities worldwide." In response, organizers across the globe geared up to organize the 8th annual Israeli Apartheid Week in support of Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law. Last year's IAW, Israeli Apartheid Week, was incredibly successful with 97 cities participating. This year, we have 112 cities worldwide hosting Israeli Apartheid Week, including universities in the West Bank, Gaza, and in South Africa. So, I'm just going to read the Indigenous Solidarity Statement right now that SAIA and HR have put together. And we ensure to read for every event so that everyone's clear about where we stand. We'd like to acknowledge that we are here today on Algonquin land, and we would like to share with you the Israeli Apartheid Week Indigenous Solidarity Statement. This week, we are gathered to assert our opposition to colonialism and apartheid, and our solidarity with Indigenous struggles for dignity and self-determination. As the organizers of Israeli Apartheid Week in Ottawa, we believe that we cannot speak meaningfully about Israeli apartheid without speaking first about the realities of apartheid here in Canada. Canada's reservation system and treatment of Indigenous peoples was closely studied by the planners of apartheid in South Africa, although this is a hidden chapter of our history. Recently, many defenders of Israel have argued that Canada's values are Israel's values, and they're right. The dispossession and theft of Palestinian lands and the creation of Palestinian open-air prisons and bantustans mimic Canada's own historical policies. From its very foundations, Canada has been based on the theft of Indigenous lands and the genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples. In crucial ways, the Canadian state treatment of Indigenous peoples, historically and currently, can be described as an apartheid system, from the imposition of the Indian Act, band councils, and the reservation system, to stolen children and residential schools, from the continued theft of lands and resources by government and corporations, to the cultural appropriation of native traditions and culture. In the face of more than 500 years of colonialism, Indigenous communities continue to resist and survive. Their multifold and diverse struggles demand our active support, especially in the face of state repression and criminalization. As non-natives, we have a role within our own communities to further the process of decolonizing Canada. If you are with us in opposition to Israeli apartheid, we encourage your consistent opposition to apartheid right here in Canada. Let us support both the resistance of Indigenous Palestinians and the survival and struggle of Canada's Indigenous nations. From Palestine to Turtle Island, there is no justice on stolen land. And of course, that statement is relevant always, but particularly with today's talk. So the organizers of this event are Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights at the University of Ottawa, as well as Students Against Israeli Apartheid, or SAIA, here at Carleton University. And we have numerous supporters that we'd like to thank, all in one big group. And without their support, we couldn't be here today. So just a few quick reminders before I introduce our speakers. And one is to please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent to ensure that the speakers are not disrupted during the talk. Also, to save your questions until after both speakers have finished, and then we'll take all of your group questions at that time. There are also marshals in the crowd. Can you put up your hands, marshals? Okay. And support workers. So if at any time throughout the presentations or after, if you'd like to speak to support workers, they are available. And also, there's absolutely no videotaping or recording of this event, except for a designated camera that we have somewhere. Right there. All right. Thank you. So I'm extremely excited today to introduce Albert Dumont, who is an Algonquin leader and poet, Albert has served with the Ottawa Native Concerns Committee since 1993 and also served with the Ottawa and District Injured Workers Group for 6 years. Albert has dedicated his life to promoting Aboriginal spirituality and healing and to protecting the rights of Aboriginal peoples, particularly those as they affect the young. Albert Dumont is the founder of Turtle Moon's Contemplation, and he will also give you some more information. As well, this is his website, so I encourage you to check out his website. And before I should have introduced the other way, before I let Albert speak, I also want to introduce right now Rana Hamadi. She's a Palestinian Canadian human rights activist whose family was brought to Canada as a result of exile from Palestine. Rana has been involved in organizing against Israeli apartheid in both Canada and Palestine. She spent several months last year writing and reporting from the occupied West Bank. Rana is on the coordinating committee of the Global March to Jerusalem, North America. That's the North America division of it. And is an organizer with Students Against Israeli Apartheid at Carleton. So please help me welcome Albert Dumont.
Thank you very much for that. I welcome you to the day and to the season, to this gathering. Before I'm going to start speaking, I'd like to start with a prayer. And before I do that, though, I'd just like to share a little story. I remember it was in the 50s. I guess I was about 7 or 8 years old, and there was an old man who lived in the community. Everybody knew him as Old Joe. And Joe was born in about 1885. He was elderly at that time. And whenever he was born, he was born with a birth defect, and it didn't allow him to speak. Everything he said sounded the same. He wouldn't know if he was speaking French or English or German or Hebrew or Egyptian or whatever. Everything he said sounded the same. And I remember, thinking about that old man one day, and I asked myself, whenever he said his prayers, did the spirits in the spirit world wonder, what did he say? Do you know what he said? Because that's not the way it was, Prayer is something that human beings should do. Everybody has the ability to pray. Joe maybe couldn't speak his prayers, but we believe that you could hold a drum and sound that drum, and whatever's in your mind, whatever your prayer is, the sounds of that drum are going to take your prayer to whoever is meant to hear them in the spirit world. Or you could shake a rattle, and the rattle too will do it. Or you could compose a dance for the purpose of prayer. Or you could chant prayer. Old Joe, he couldn't speak, but he could chant, and he could beat a drum, and he could shake a rattle, and he could have composed his prayers that way. And something about prayers, it's not how great of a wordsmith you are. Every prayer is heard with great eloquence and beauty in the spirit world, and you're not wasting your time when you pray. We need to understand something about the spirit world. If everyone in this room had no choice but to move up to the Yukon at some point, well, somebody of sound mind would find out everything they could about the Yukon if they were going to have to go there. They'd wonder about how much gardening time they were going to have, and what kind of the life was up there, and things like that, sensible things. But I got to tell you, everybody in this room is going to go to the spirit world someday. And you need to think about that. You need to think about going to that place, because it's just common sense. It's foolish not to think about that. So that's why we pray before we start important things like this. So thank you very much, Great Spirit, for everything you have placed in my homeland. I acknowledge and honor every tree, river, lake, and stream. I acknowledge and honor every bird, animal, fish, and human being. I'm especially grateful, Great Spirit, for all those things you have given us, so we can prepare ourselves spiritually for that spirit world that will begin when this short physical life ends. We ask you now, Great Spirit, to fill this room with your blessings and to touch each of us with the wisdom of our Anishinaabe ancestors. We ask that the words that will be spoken here tonight will be good words and strong words, and that the people who are here will be enriched by those words in an emotional and in a spiritual way. We ask this of you, Great Spirit, because of the great respect we have for all that you have made. Just want to tell you a few things about myself. I was born in Kittigan-Zibi Reserve in 1950. And we left the reserve when I was 6 years old, and we lived my father got a job in a mining town, because he had been a lumberjack and a guide, and one of the people he was guiding for was a wealthy American. If you've ever heard of Sherwin-Williams Paints, he used to guide for John Sherwin. And John Sherwin liked my dad, I guess, and he got him a job in the mine that he had shares in. And in those days, there was Indian agents, and you just couldn't get up and leave the reserve. You had to go and see the Indian agent, and he had to okay it. But because John Sherwin was a wealthy American with shares in businesses and things in Canada, we were able to leave the reserve, and we lived outside this town for the first year, and then we moved into the town. The second year, I went to a one-room schoolhouse that first year. But whenever we moved into the town, there was a school went right up to high school. And that first month wasn't very good. People, by that time my mother had contracted tuberculosis, so she was in a sanitarium. My father was working night shift. He was working shift work at the mine. And the people would come at night and they would throw stuff at our house. And they'd say, "Go back where you came from, you damn Indians." I don't know where they expected us to go. We were right in the heart of the Algonquin homeland at the time they told us that. We used to get blamed for everything. Every kind of devilment that occurred in the town, they'd say, "Oh, it had to be the Indians who did it." I've never been invited to a birthday party, and because in those days it just wasn't. People didn't really want an Indian kid in their house. And I'm mentioning that because I want to speak about that a little bit later on, about how things. You've got to wonder whether things are getting better or not. So, anyways, we were there, and there was lots of racism. I've got a grade 7 education. It's not, I wanted an education. I wanted to have a university or college education. But on the third day of school in grade 8, the teachers told me to leave the school and never come back, and I never did. But that was because in grade 5, I went into rebellion mode. Because I didn't like what they were saying about Aboriginal people in history books. I didn't believe it. There's one teacher in particular, when she'd tell about some kind of a massacre or something, and then she'd look right at me while she was saying it. And all the kids, they'd clue in and they'd all stare at me like I was guilty of scalping people. And I'd be sitting there wondering, what do you look at me for? I didn't kill anybody. So I didn't like it, so I went into rebellion mode, and I was more than a handful. I guess they tolerated me for 3 more years, and I tolerated them. And then finally one day all hell broke loose, and they told me never to go back to school. I never did. But I became a bricklayer. By the time I was 21, I could brick a house all the way around and do a good job of it. So, I'm not an idiot. So the thing is this, though, that racism and how a country will view a segment of the community, and they will look at them in a negative way. And it's totally unfair. It's unjust. This homeland right here, where I'm standing right now, it's stolen land. You know, we were brought to the brink of extinction. By the government's own statistics, there was only 1,300 Algonquins left in the year 1900. You know, there was other Algonquins in the forest, and they didn't step out of the forest and say, hey, did you count me? But by their own statistics, though. But the Algonquins that they could count, in the year 1900, there was only 1,300 of us left on the face of the earth. Imagine that. How much closer do you want to get to being extinct than that? But in 1914, when war broke out, they had young Algonquins out in the front lines. One of our guys was killed at Vimy Ridge. You know, but that's the way things are. Talking about the war, you know, the War of 1812, a lot of historians believe that if it wasn't for the contribution of the Anishinaabe, that maybe Canada would have never happened. Because we'd all be American. I don't know how many of us would be in this room right now, because who would have been killed in Vietnam or those kind of wars. But you know, they're going to rename Wellington Street in Ottawa. I guess they're looking at naming it Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard. Why don't they name it Anishinaabe Boulevard? That'll never happen, though. I've got daughters and I've got granddaughters. I don't have any sons or grandsons. I think I need to tell you that whenever one of my girls, she wasn't yet 12 years old, and she was with her mother, and her mother went into a Rogers Video to get a movie, and she'd stepped out onto Bank Street. And she looks about, when she was that age, she looked to be about 17, I guess, 16 or 17, because she's tall. She was wearing Aboriginal jewelry. And this man was walking by, and he walked up to her and he said, "You fucking squaw," and he spit right in her face. Now, who does something like that? Why would somebody, like that guy that did that, I guess he was upset that the Indians were protecting a burial ground at a place called Oka. He didn't like that, so he thought he'd go and spit in the child's face. He didn't come and spit in my face, because a racist person is a coward, a bully and a coward. Kids are open season to them. You know those people who write all those negative stories in the newspaper about Aboriginals? And those people that they teach to hate? You think they care about those people that they make hate out of people? They don't care about them. They wouldn't let somebody like that marry into their family any more than they'd want an Indian married into their family. And that's a fact. Hate is a terrible thing. I remember too, when I was bricking a house one time in the country. And I had this fellow working for me, and I was stuck for a helper, and that's the only reason why he was there, because if I wouldn't have been stuck for somebody to mix the mortar for me, I would have never had him on the job site. Because this man hated everybody. Here he was in his 50s, and he'd go at night and he used to slash the tires of at the Jamaican club or the Italian club, and then he'd laugh about it the next day. He'd say, "I slashed 10 tires last night at the Jamaican club, ha ha ha." And Rick would just shake their head. He hated everybody with an accent. He didn't care if it was a Scottish accent or a French accent or a German accent. If you had an accent, he hated you. He was a Protestant, he hated Catholics. He hated Italians. I don't know what he had to say about Indians whenever I was out of earshot, but I'll bet you it wasn't very nice. Anyways, this one day he's mixing mortar for me, and it was a very windy day. And my mortar board was running out of mortar, and I looked to see what he was doing, because I was paying him to bring mortar to me so I could lay bricks. And he was standing beside the wheelbarrow and he was looking up in the sky like that. I didn't pay no mind, I just kept on working. A few minutes later, There's less mortar on my board, and I looked to see what he was up to. He's still standing there, and he's looking up at the sky. I shouted over to him, I says, "Hey, what are you doing there? I need some mortar here." He says, "Look at that bird." And there was a bird flying against the wind. A small bird, and its wings were really flying. But it wasn't getting anywhere. It was just staying in that one spot. He says to me, "You know," he says, "I've been watching that bird now for 10 minutes. It hasn't moved an inch. You know, if I was that bird," he said, "I'd turn around and go the other way." I said, "Never mind the bird. I've been watching you for 10 minutes. You haven't moved an inch either." But I thought about it later. And I saw something, you know. That man, he was an alcoholic. He used to like to drink the hard stuff. And I realized something. That's how he lived his life. Every time his life took him to where there was a place of turbulence. Every time he went up against the wind, that's what he did, all right. He turned around and he went the other way. And I tell that story to teenagers. I said, you know, don't be like him. He'd turn around and go the other way, go to the liquor store, buy a bottle, go home and find some reason to hate somebody. Be like the bird. The bird was determined to get to where it was going. And you know, whatever the situation is, people who are like that bird are human beings. People who hate are like that guy. And if we really believe that we're going to go into a spirit world when we leave this life, I can tell you that there's going to be, hate won't exist where I'm going. Technology won't exist, and Canada won't exist there either. Who would put their soul on the line to hate somebody and believe stories that the media dishes out without wanting to hear something of the other side, so that they can decide what they're going to do with it? But whatever they do with it, they shouldn't sink that to that depth where they're going to hate somebody over it. Hate is a serious thing. I tell you what, I don't hate anybody. I've got a lot of reasons why I should, though. That man that spit in my daughter's face, I don't hate him. One of my buddies said to me that next day, he said, "We'll take your daughter and we'll go to that place on Bank Street." He says, "I'm going to have an axe handle with me." He said, "And we'll wait there, and even if it takes a week, that guy must come there every now and then, because maybe he lives in the neighborhood." He said, "Whenever he comes, and your daughter, all she's got to do is point him out. And then you and your daughter go away." And he says, "I'm going to deal with that guy." I said to my daughter, "What do you think about that?" She said, "No. I just feel bad that there's people like that in the world." But she didn't want no violence on her. That's the way it is. I remember how it was that I became an activist in 1993. There was a 16-year-old boy, Chippewa, from Cape Broker. He was 16 years old and he weighed 115 pounds and he was 5'3". And he was a ward of the Children's Aid Society and he was living in Smiths Falls, Ontario. And one day there was 8 white men in an apartment building, and they saw him out in the street. And they opened the window and they said, "Hey, come on up and party with us." And as soon as he came in that door, the biggest man in there took a hold of him and started beating him. He beat him until he was dead. And then they took his body and they buried his body in a shallow grave outside of Smiths Falls, where it stayed for almost 13 months. Somebody called Crime Stoppers, and the 8 white men were rounded up. 1 was charged with first-degree murder. 3 of them were charged with accessory to first-degree murder. And 4 of them weren't charged at all because they cooperated with the police investigation. What makes people like that? What did the Indians ever do to them? What did my family ever do to those people who came to throw rocks when my dad was going to work and say to us, go back where you came from? It's hard to understand why. Because you know something about this territory? Like I said, it was stolen from us. It's still land claims negotiations. Stolen land. And now they're talking about a treaty, and the government of Canada is saying that they're only going to recognize the Algonquins who live in Ontario and not the Algonquins who live in the Quebec side. It's like God saying, you know, you people aren't here who you think you are anymore. We're just going to deal with this people here. Like, who else would put up with that? The people of the world. Who would put up with that? Not very many. A lot of people will be going for the guns, I'll tell you that. But we don't do such things because we understand something about life, purpose of life. Our purpose of life as a community was to be keepers of the earth, keepers of the land. In this territory here, there's $1 billion a year that's removed from it. $1 billion a year. In timber, in mineral wealth, hydro, hunting and fishing licenses and outfitting camps and all the stuff like that. But you go further north in Kittigunzibi to those other reserves, and they're living in third world conditions. And whenever there's clear cutting that goes on up there 24 hours a day, and if those Algonquins from Barrier Lake and wherever that protested, the government sends up 200 police officers in body armor. And whoever's holding the bullhorn, that person's going to go to jail. The bullhorn falls on the ground, whoever picks it up, they're going to jail next. Who'd put up with that? It's stolen land. You know, I was part of an interfaith group, and I asked the faith leaders, I said, you ever talk to your congregations or your parishioners or whatever about the fact that your houses of worship are built on stolen land and that the people here are still being oppressed? Nobody does. I don't know why. You know, like, I mean, if a person really believes in the existence of another world that begins when physical life ends, I demand it from my faith leader. I'd say, I need you to explain something. Why aren't we doing something about these people that are being oppressed here? Why are we allowing it? Like, I mean, we're prospering here. That's the way that stuff like that, it doesn't make any sense to me. I know one time we spoke at this Health Canada at a lodge there, and I taught about those racist people who are so full of hate of Aboriginal communities. And I had this to say about it. I said, you know, there's never been a colonizer or a settler or anybody else that ever came from any place else on this planet that didn't set foot on this land and wish it was them that God had given this land to. God didn't give it to them. There was already human beings here called the First Peoples, the Anishinaabe. We've always been known as that. Our creation story begins here. Those people, those colonizers and settlers and whatever else that came here, you think they brought the Great Lakes with them and insert them in the ground here and say, there now, we have the Great Lakes here, the greatest lakes you'll find anywhere on this planet. They didn't bring the falls like what you find on the Niagara River and say, here now, you've got the greatest falls here that you'll find anywhere on the earth. They didn't bring the gold and the silver and the oil and put it in the ground here and say, there now, we brought this here with us. They didn't bring the timber here. They didn't put the sap in the maple tree and then say to the people here, look, take this sap and boil it and make maple syrup out of it. They didn't do those things. But they behaved like they did though. They behaved like it was them that brought all this riches here, and the beauty. But it was the keepers of the land who were already living here who kept this land healthy. You know, one time there was a writer for the Globe and Mail, and she wrote a column, and she said that at the time of contact, what the Europeans found here were savages. And she said when she said that to her friend said to her, well, at least they weren't hurting the environment. And she says, how are you going to hurt the environment if all you have is a stone axe? I didn't have to think about it too long. I said, I'd like to see her build a birch bark canoe. That lady who wrote that column. You think building a birch bark canoe is something simple? It's the same kind of engineering to build a birch bark canoe that's needed to build a London Bridge. Anyone who could invent a birch bark canoe could invent something more serious than a stone axe to bring destruction to the land if it was their wish to do so. Because they took that bark from that birch tree without harming the tree. There's a genius there, you know. And if we would have been left alone to evolve, who knows where we'd be. It's not easy to build a birch bark canoe, you know, to invent things like snowshoes and stuff like that we were using at the time of contact. Whenever we helped, because we were kind and sharing and generous people. The fact of the matter is that whenever those people who first came here on our shores, and they saw the Great Lakes, and they saw that the land had riches, and they saw that there was land here. But there was people here, and they said, well, we got to get rid of these people first, however we can. We need to take every step necessary to rid this land of these people that are here, because we want to exploit this land, we want to rape it. And they didn't care how many people they killed. I mean, 1,300 Algonquins left in the year 1900.